Hello and welcome to Boxset, Binge the Bible, the podcast from Seven Vineyard, where we are listening through the whole Bible in a year and seeing how we think about it, how we feel about it, how it's moving us to maybe see the world or do things differently. My name is Bern, Leckie. I'm joined by Owen, Lynch.
Hello.
We've been listening through a very interesting set of historical accounts from the Book of Kings. It's split into two books in our Bibles, but we've sort of gone either side of the split to read the end of 1 Kings and the beginning of 2 Kings, and together I think they tell quite a coherent story, but it's a different story. It's an interesting story. What have you made of it, Owen?
To put it in context for our listeners, what we talked about last week was the follow-on from David's reign and then his son Solomon, and then how Solomon's son Rehoboam effectively did an Independence Day thing and decided to tax all the people in the north, and they rebelled and they decided they were going to separate and form a new kingdom, which they called Israel. And in the south, Judah, centered on Jerusalem, was still led by Rehoboam. And of course, what we see and what we saw in those stories was Solomon and Rehoboam really just amassing huge amounts of wealth for themselves. And so for me, what I found really instructive in listening has been this sense of God responding to the wealth and the corruption of Solomon and Rehoboam. I've just been struck by the way in which the prophets speak against the injustice and idolatry. That's really what struck me.
Yes, so it's the inclusion of the prophets that really makes this turn a corner, and I think where the prophets take us in the story that makes this history feel very different from some of the sorts of history that I learnt at school. I don't know about you, the history I learnt was largely about kings and queens and dates and big important events, right? So timelines you can remember.
Yeah.
And obviously it's important to know who was leading the country at whatever time, and maybe you might bring in, as you get a bit later, big companies and big other influences in our history too. And that seemed to me like all that history was about until sometime during secondary school that there was a sort of conscious attempt to flip the camera round, if you like, and see if we could actually work. What could we know about the lives of ordinary people? And I lived in Birmingham. And one of the things that we have in Birmingham or near Birmingham is the Black Country Museum, which is a brilliant place to go and immerse yourself in the lives of people from a couple of hundred years ago. My big recollection from that is all we know from history about the lives of ordinary people is it was a bit rubbish and there was lots of suffering. And generally in the lives of ordinary people, there wasn't really much you could do about it. Now, why is this different? Why is this history of Israel different from this? Well, yes, you've got kings and leaders. Yes, you've got this whole big system of religion being talked about as well. But these prophets, they bring power in from God in unexpected ways and unexpected situations. And what I love about this story is about Elijah and his sort of prodigy Elisha is that God's power affects everybody that they meet and especially makes a big difference in the lives of ordinary people. Did you notice that?
Yeah, I did. And, it's funny because when I think about these prophets, obviously we're seeing here prophets, very much in the religious garb, performing miracles, speaking on behalf of God. But at the root, what I see is them speaking up for the poor, the marginalised, and the oppressed. And very much what we're seeing is the stories of the poor, the marginalised, and the oppressed in this. I mean, I think of like that farmer Naboth, whose farm, his vineyard is destroyed. So he's killed rather in order for the Ahab to take over his vineyard and farm. That was just one example of the way in which powerful people in powerful positions abuse their authority and steal what is not theirs, and then kill the owner. And there's just a huge injustice there, and that's a great example of the sorts of injustice that these prophets Elijah and Elisha are really speaking against. And for me, Bern, when I think about this, I think in contemporary times, I think about people that speak truth to power here as well.
Yeah.
I think of protest organisations. I think of campaigning groups. I think of opposition MPs. I'm thinking of, real inspirational, charismatic people who have caught the attention of the public and leading a campaign against, some abuse or some corruption. I mean, look at the way in which the rivers and the pollution in the rivers in Britain has come to the sort of national consciousness. We're all realising that the rivers and the beaches are polluted because the water companies aren't investing in all of the sewage management systems properly, so therefore we're getting pollution. And there's one person that sticks in my mind. I don't know if you remember him from the 80s or 90s. He was called Fergal Sharkey. Do you remember him?
I know Fergal Sharkey a little bit, yeah, because he's worked in radio and been a regulator and all sorts of things, yes.
Right, exactly. And there's a man who's actually associated with leading, calling these water companies to account, calling the government to account. And he's a prophetic voice in that situation, leading the opposition, calling out these organisations, these powerful leaders, calling them out and saying, what you're doing is wrong, it's corrupt. And it needs to change, and that's kind of how I see these kind of figures, Elisha and Elijah. Although, to be fair, they are very much dressed up in religious garb, and we recognise them in a religious context, which, of course, it really was.
Yes. No, in the ancient understanding, it was impossible to separate the workings of the world from the religious beliefs in gods, because gods were there to explain and link to all the masses of things in the world, the universe, that we don't know.
Yeah.
So if there's power that you need or stuff you don't understand, well, you better rely on your god or your gods, and what that results in, and very dramatically, this brilliant story about Elijah, which I love, is something I would love to see demonstrated in our political debates. So I find the political debates this year have been a bit boring. But imagine, But imagine that you could settle differences the way Elijah did with the competing ideas of the prophets of Baal. So instead of just having an argument and trying to win the argument who was the most logical, or instead of just trying to appeal to, come up with the best line and see who, got the best treatment in the spin room afterwards and who voted for them at a poll. Now, nuts to that. We're going to get a great big fire together. We're going to get a great big pile of stuff together, and we're going to agree that whoever's right, whoever's got the real God on their side, can do some stuff. And this would be an event, right?
Yeah.
You'd have a lot of people watching this if this was on telly. And so I just love the way that can be dramatized and shown, that the power of Baal and gods that the Israelites are saying, well, that's not real gods though, is it? The power of that way of doing things was just no power at all. It was a bunch of people yapping about how they believed in this stuff. But the power of their God, the power of Yahweh, they had a real God on their side who could kick some butt, right? And I just love the exchange in there as well. It's like, because it's not even a polite exchange. It's like, where is your God then? Is he sleeping? Maybe he's having a wee. Maybe you need to shout louder and wake him up. It's a hilarious story about serious things, and how you can translate that into, well, what do we do with that today? I'm not sure as we would want to directly translate that into, hey, yeah, this is how we have discussions, but interfaith discussions. No, let's not do that. But to take that dramatic image that there is real power associated with God and belief in God, and believe that and rely on that, I think that's very powerful and very, very important.
Yeah, definitely. They're looking for leverage, aren't they, in their arguments there? And what I find quite interesting is one verse in, I think it's 2 Kings 2:9, where there's this handover of kind of responsibility from Elijah to his protege Elisha. And I hope you can hear the difference in my pronunciation between those two men's names there. But Elisha asks Elijah in response to, what would you like me to do for you? He says, give me double your power. So I want twice as much power as you've had to kind of continue to speak truth to power. I found that quite fascinating because actually, I think it's true. I've only read this, so I haven't counted it up myself, so this is secondhand. But Elijah performed 7 miracles, and Elisha is recorded as performing 14 miracles, which is an interesting observation. But essentially, it's about having leverage, and they used their miraculous supernatural power to gain leverage with the powerful authorities, particularly Ahab and Jezebel, the king and his queen, to gain influence over them, really. And I find that really interesting because, you know, when I look at the role of prophets in the Old Testament, I see 2 things that they are doing. One is they're calling out idolatry, but they're also calling out an injustice. And I think there's an interesting observation that I would make about the relationship between idolatry and injustice. Because idolatry really was about the worship of other gods or other idols other than Yahweh. And what happens in other nations is born of their idolatry. In other words, what their cultural norms are arise from the type of idol or god that they worship. Now, what we see in the story so far in the Bible is the story of the nation of Israel, of Judah, obeying the cultural norms established by their forefathers in relationship with Yahweh. And what happens is that the warning has always been, just obey Yahweh. Don't ever allow yourself to be led off in the worship of other idols. Why? Well, there could be loads of reasons, but one reason that really stands out to me is that your cultural norms will change. The things that you value will change. And what we see here is the prophets saying, remain faithful to Yahweh and remain faithful to the cultural norms that define us as a nation or as a people. And I think we see the sort of the demise of the kingdom, of the northern kingdom, in spite of Elijah and Elisha's best efforts, with one particular image which I think relates to the worship of an idol which required child sacrifice. And of course that was completely an abomination to Yahweh, and it was an abomination to the Israelites, and so it's really, that's a really good example of why idolatry leads to injustice. That Yahweh is not unjust, so the cultural norms that are established on the commands of Yahweh ensure justice for the poor, the oppressed, and the needy, and the most vulnerable in society. And I just find that really, really interesting, that there's this relationship between what you worship and what you consider to be just and right. And I think that's something certainly I've been thinking about just in my own life. Where do I get my cultural norms from?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that the system that God sets up for Israel isn't... It would sound weird if I said wasn't a perfect system, but I mean, with the benefit of hindsight, that religion on its own and law on its own doesn't necessarily change our hearts and minds. It can show us, as Paul wrote in the New Testament, it can kind of show us where we're going wrong, but we need something else as well. And the things that it looks like God consistently wanted to do with Israel was to demonstrate the power and the need for love and for grace and for learning and for forgiveness and for all these things which are very hard to codify in the law, but were really necessary for people to really have power in their everyday lives. And one of the things that I think stands out to me in the roles of the prophets, like how do the prophets make a real difference in this part of Israel's story, is, as you say, well, for one thing, they're showing the importance of turning away from foreign gods or things that look a bit like God but aren't really God. The importance of really learning to rely on God and keeping a close relationship with him. But that's not just the importance of leaders doing that, although there are lots of stories about leaders doing that. It's the importance and the need for that among ordinary people. I love the transition sort of the growth and progression, if you like, that you get from Elijah to Elisha. You've got Elijah who's showing in some small ways how it's really important to make a difference. When he's staying with someone who needs some help and needs some healing. Yes, you can have some healing. Yes, you can have some relief from your financial suffering. But then Elisha does that, but in much more dramatic ways. That story of the people who run out of money and are in debt. But Elisha can say, oh, okay, well, how about you go and grab all these jars then from your neighbours? You're going to need relationships. Within your relationships, go and get as much as you can, and God will fill up all of everything that you can bring along. He will fill that up with value and blessing. And you can literally go and sell this oil to go off and pay your debts, and you can live on the rest. And to me, that's symptomatic of much greater things even to come that we'll see in Jesus. Isn't it amazing when you read the stories of Elijah and Elisha? These are the stories perhaps in the Old Testament that almost sound the most like, oh, that sounds like it could be Jesus there. Most important, I think, probably the other way around, is that the people who first heard the stories of Jesus would probably be thinking of the stories of Elijah and Elisha and going, it's Jesus. He's reminding me of something. He's reminding me of... What's he reminding me of? He's reminding me of these really important prophets. The prophets who made massive differences in the lives of ordinary people. Can I share with you as well one of my favourite Elisha stories as well? Because I think there's another important kind of dimension to Elisha's work, that you see the way he deals with people who are not Israelites. So the story is that there is a military leader from another country, is the commander of the army of the king of Aram, and he approaches the king of Israel looking for healing. And the king of Israel says, am I God? Can I do that? No, I can't do that. But Elisha gets involved, and Elisha goes, oh yeah, God can totally do this, and gives him instructions to go and get healed. And Naaman, this guy who needs the healing, gets really angry about them and says, why didn't you tell me to do something sensible? This wasn't what I was expecting, just to go and wash in your muddy water somewhere. And Elisha says, well, if I'd told you to do something really dramatic, would you have done that? This is what God's telling you to do. Why don't you just go and do it? And then you get healed. And he found, oh, yes, okay, yes, it can work like that. Amazing. Now, why is that amazing? Firstly, God heals. Second, God heals through ways that we find a bit weird, that we don't expect, that might require us to do things that are stretching us a bit. But also, this isn't confined to one set of people. It's not confined to Israel. It's not confined to the Jewish people. It's not. This was a strange message to give to the Jewish people who were desperately keen to kind of remind themselves of who they were and their closeness of their relationship to God and how much God loved them and wanted to bless them. No, God's message to them was, I'm going to use you to bless everybody. That's who you really are. You're the people I'm going to use to bless everybody. Isn't that amazing? That
is an amazing theme that runs right through the Bible. I'm really glad you pointed that out in this context, because I think that's really important, because we see it over and over and over again, don't we, as we work our way through the Bible. That's really great. And of course, finding its summation in Acts, actually, and even in the letters of Paul as well, which we'll talk about. Actually, no, we've talked about Acts. We've been through Acts already, haven't we? I've forgotten that right back at the start.
We're still talking about it, Sam. We're still going through
the reason is, Bern, as you know, is I am doing a box set series on Acts at the moment. And if our listeners haven't been listening to that, I really would encourage you to. I've really enjoyed kind of digging deep into Acts, and in 6 months on, we're still in Acts. We're only halfway through it, actually, so it's lots of fun. Lots more to come on that.
Yes, so I think between what we've seen about prophets and the Spirit moving in Israel in this time, and what we see about the Spirit moving through people who were following Jesus in the time of Acts of the Apostles, there is so much similarity. But what we see, I think, is the fulfilment that the Spirit can live in other people, not just in the prophets. So this is where the history really blows up, because you've got, what is history? It's the story of powerful people who led countries. Or it's a story of religious leaders who led worship. No, it's also the story of these mysterious, very small in number, spirit-filled people in Old Testament times, but now is the thing that's open to us. That's our story. That's a story that God wants us to be part of. So I find that kind of simultaneously exciting and awe-inspiring, also kind of scary, because this power is real. And the question is then, how do we stop that just being a weird belief in our heads and a thing to argue about? And how do we let God really work through us to do all these things that were important in the stories of the prophets, so that we don't see so much social injustice, so we don't see so much suffering? Could God want me and you listening, if you believe in God and you're filled with the Holy Spirit, how does God want to use you this week to meet someone's need in maybe a surprising way? We don't know. I can't tell you. God could tell you. And this seems like a good place to give the podcast a rest and go off and have a pray.
Yeah, that sounds great. So we're going to pick up next week with the northern kingdom, the Israel, kind of being carried off into exile, and then what happens to the southern kingdom. That's what we're going to be talking about next week. So do join us if you would like to next week as we look onwards into the latter part of Kings. We'll see you then.
Bye.